There is a sentence that government officials around the world reach for whenever they want to expand surveillance powers without having to defend the surveillance itself. You're either with law enforcement or you're with the criminals. It is a sentence designed to end a conversation, not start one. And in the third week of June 2026, Canada's Public Safety Minister, Gary Anandasangari, said exactly that to members of Parliament who were raising questions about a bill called an Act Respecting Lawful Access, known in the legislative record as Bill C-22. The bill passed. It passed quietly, in the final days before Parliament rose for its summer recess, alongside a wave of other legislation covering everything from military justice reform to election security to victims' rights. Most of those other bills receive the kind of coverage you would expect for significant legal reforms. Bill C-22 did not. It moved through committee with what one of Canada's leading technology law scholars, University of Ottawa professor Michael Geist, has publicly called midnight madness, a process where amendments and substantive debate were systematically pushed aside in the rush to get the bill through before the legislative calendar closed. Most coverage that did exist treated this as a routine national security update. The operational reality is considerably more consequential, and it connects directly to a decision two technology companies have now signaled they may be forced to make: whether to keep operating in Canada at all. Here is what actually happened. Bill C-22 expands the legal definition of an electronic service provider to include not just traditional telecommunications companies, but messaging applications and VPN providers. That single definitional change is the entire story, because everything that follows depends on it. Once a company falls under this expanded definition, it becomes subject to two new obligations that did not exist in Canadian law before this bill. First, the company can be compelled, through a secret ministerial order that the company is not permitted to disclose, to build an encryption backdoor into its own system. Second, the company is required to retain user metadata, the record of who communicated with whom, when, and from where, for a period of 6 months. Think about what those two requirements mean for a company like Signal. Signal's entire business model, its entire reason for existing, is built on a single architectural promise: end-to-end encryption with no backdoor, no exception, no master key that anyone, including Signal itself, can use to read your messages. That is not a marketing slogan. It is the technical foundation the company is built on, and it is the reason journalists, human rights workers, domestic violence survivors, and ordinary citizens around the world trust the platform with their most sensitive communications. A law that compels a backdoor is not a law Signal can comply with while remaining Signal. The company has been entirely consistent about this position in every jurisdiction that has tried to compel backdoor access, going back years in countries far larger than Canada. There is no reason to expect a different answer here. Windscribe, a Canadian-founded VPN company that has built its reputation specifically on a strict no-logs policy, faces the same impossible choice. You cannot simultaneously promise customers that you do not retain their data and comply with a legal requirement to retain 6 months of metadata on every user. These are not negotiable design choices that a company can quietly compromise on. They are the entire value proposition. Comply, and the product stops being the product. Don't comply, and the company is operating outside Canadian law in its own home market. Now hold that against the internal architecture of the bill itself, because here is the detail that almost no coverage outside specialist legal circles has properly explained. Bill C-22 contains two provisions that directly contradict each other. Section 5, subsection 5, contains language promising that the law will not require companies to introduce systemic vulnerabilities into their encryption. That is the provision the government points to when critics raise the backdoor concern. It sounds reassuring. But Section 12 of the same bill requires companies to comply with ministerial orders to provide decrypted access when compelled. Read those two provisions side by side, and the contradiction is immediate. You cannot promise no systemic vulnerability while simultaneously mandating decrypted access on demand. A backdoor that only opens when the government asks is still a backdoor. It is still a vulnerability built into the system's architecture, because the moment that mechanism exists for the government, it exists, structurally, for anyone who discovers how to trigger it without government authorization. Hackers do not need permission to use a vulnerability. They need only its existence. This is the central technical truth that every serious cryptographer who has studied government backdoor proposals for the past 3 decades keeps repeating. And Canadian legislators appear to have either not understood it or chosen not to engage with it. You cannot build a door that opens only for one specific person holding one specific key while remaining permanently and absolutely closed to everyone else who might eventually find the lock. Once the door exists, its security depends entirely on the integrity of every system protecting access to that key, forever, against an unlimited number of attempts to find it. That is not a policy question. It is a structural fact about how computer security functions. So why did the government move forward anyway? And why so quickly in the final days of the parliamentary session with limited public debate? The official framing offered by Minister Ananda Sangari centers on crime, organized crime, online exploitation, the difficulty law enforcement faces when communications are encrypted end-to-end. That framing is not fabricated. Law enforcement agencies in Canada and around the world have genuinely struggled with cases where encrypted communications prevented them from gathering evidence they believe could have stopped serious crimes. That difficulty is real, and the frustration behind it is real. But the operational reality of this bill extends considerably further than the crime-fighting framing suggests, and that is the part most coverage missed. The expanded definition of electronic service provider does not target a narrow category of criminal communication tools. It captures every VPN, every encrypted messaging app, every Canadian or foreign company offering privacy-protective communication services to ordinary Canadians for entirely ordinary reasons. A small business owner protecting trade secrets, a journalist communicating with a source, a domestic violence survivor coordinating with a support network without her abuser's knowledge. A teenager messaging friends about something they would rather their parents not see. None of these use cases are criminal. All of them depend on the same encryption architecture this bill compromises. And here's where this story connects to something larger than Bill C-22 itself. This was not the only piece of legislation expanding state control over digital life that passed through Parliament in this same legislative window. In the same weeks, Bill C-25 restricted certain categories of AI-generated political content. Earlier legislation moving through committee, often discussed under the names C-34 and C-36, established mandatory age verification infrastructure for social media platforms and consolidated content oversight and privacy enforcement into a single government-appointed commission. Each of these measures, examined individually, comes with its own specific justification: election integrity, child safety, crime prevention. But examined together, they form a consistent direction. The Canadian state is expanding across nearly every digital channel simultaneously, its legal capacity to identify, monitor, and access the communications and identities of its own citizens. Bill C-22 is not an isolated security update. It is one more component in an architecture that has been under construction for the better part of a year. The contrast with Canada's closest allies makes the scale of this divergence clear. The European Union, through its General Data Protection Regulation and the more recent Digital Services Act, has built a regulatory system that deliberately separates Data Protection Authority from Content Regulation Authority, precisely to prevent the kind of concentrated government power that critics say Bill C-22 and its companion legislation create. The United Kingdom maintains a similar separation between its Information Commissioner's Office and Ofcom. The United States has resisted mandated encryption backdoors for years, in part because its own intelligence and cybersecurity agencies have warned that backdoors weaken national security as much as they strengthen law enforcement capability, since any vulnerability built for domestic access can eventually be discovered and exploited by foreign adversaries. Canada, with Bill C-22, has positioned itself as a genuine outlier among its closest democratic allies, adopting an approach that those allies have specifically examined and declined to pursue. Now think about what happens next, because this is where the abstract policy debate becomes a concrete economic question. If Signal and Windscribe follow through on the warnings they have issued and withdraw from the Canadian market rather than compromise their core privacy architecture, the immediate effect is straightforward. Canadians lose access to two specific products. But the signal that sends to the broader technology sector is considerably larger. Every company evaluating whether to locate data infrastructure, research operations, or corporate headquarters in Canada now has a new data point. Canada is a jurisdiction where the government can compel an encryption backdoor through a secret order that the company receiving it is legally barred from disclosing. That is not a detail that disappears once the immediate controversy fades from the news cycle. It becomes part of the permanent risk calculation for every privacy-conscious technology company considering Canadian operations for years into the future, regardless of how aggressively or rarely the government actually invokes the power it has now given itself. The standard has changed. For most of Canada's recent technology policy history, the country positioned itself as a stable, predictable jurisdiction with strong rule of law and a regulatory environment broadly aligned with its closest allies. Bill C-22 breaks that alignment in a specific and measurable way, on a question, encryption, where the rest of the democratic world has converged on a different answer. The government's own internal contradiction, the gap between the no vulnerability promise in Section 5 and the compelled access mandate in Section 12, suggests that even the bill's drafters may not have fully reconciled what they were building. That is not a reassuring detail. It is the kind of detail that tends to surface in court challenges, in corporate legal opinions, and in the boardroom conversations of every company now deciding whether to stay. Watch two things in the weeks ahead. First, watch whether Signal or Windscribe issue a formal statement confirming withdrawal from the Canadian market, because that would convert a warning into an economic fact with measurable consequences for Canadian consumers and for the country's standing as a destination for technology investment. Second, watch whether the contradiction between Section 5, and Section 12 becomes the basis for a constitutional or administrative law challenge, because Canadian courts have shown a willingness in recent years to scrutinize legislation that promises one thing in its stated principles and delivers another in its operative provisions. The same legislative session that produced Bill C-22 also produced a Supreme Court ruling reinforcing that government actors can be held accountable in court when they act in bad faith. The architecture being built for compelled access exists in the same legal environment as that accountability ruling, and the two are likely to meet sooner rather than later. A door built for one purpose does not stay limited to that purpose. It stays open for whoever eventually finds it. Canada has just built one. The question now is, who walks through it first? The police investigating the crime the government says this law is for, or someone else entirely? If this story is telling you something you have not heard elsewhere, share it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear it. Like the video if you want more of this, and I will see you in the next.